Okay, let me start. Somebody just asked me a question that shocked me about K&S Associates. You probably, most of you never heard of that, and I wondered how you knew about that. Apparently it was in the newspaper this morning. There's an antitrust trial going on in Nashville. They're in Judge Sharp's court, in the district court, the building right next to the Frisk Center. I was the expert for the plaintiffs, and I testified yesterday, so up until yesterday, I couldn't even tell you that I was working for them. It's now in the newspaper, and so the timing is pretty good, and it's public. There's one person sitting in on the trial, and that's the Tennessean reporter. Antitrust trials don't usually draw as big a crowd as divorces between country music celebrities or something like that. And I mentioned to the guy yesterday, he was sitting next to me, I said, I don't think any of your readers are going to be interested in this. Since that's the chapter that I squeezed out, the one on antitrust and regulation, and since it turns out it's on what, the back of the front section, did you say? Or
no, it's in the business.
In the business section. It's way, way back in the newspaper. Let me give you a 5-minute synopsis of it, and I'll try to be fair to both sides. This involves an industry that some of you may have relied on, not knowing it. If you ever had any radiation therapy, you want this industry to be in business, because what the three companies in this business do is they calibrate the equipment that accompanies the radiation equipment. This equipment that accompanies the radiation equipment measures the amount of radiation that is absorbed by tissues in radiation therapy, most commonly for cancer. And you would like that measurement to be accurate, so that I was just joking with somebody here. I had a dentist take an x-ray of a tooth last week, which he now wants to do a root canal on. Exciting. Boy, are they a lot easier than they were 30 years ago now. But what I didn't want was for him accidentally to shoot 2,500 times as much radiation into the side of my face as he was supposed to. So you have this equipment to measure the amount of radiation, and every so often, if they drop it on the floor or move it around and stuff, it might get out of whack in the same way that your scale at home, when nobody's on it, you look at it one day and say, hey, it says 7 pounds. For heaven's sakes, no wonder I'm overweight. So you turn it down, and in my house, we turn it down to about -5 or something like that. So you're calibrating it the way you would like it to be calibrated. Okay, and that's what this little industry, with only 3 firms in it, does. It calibrates the measuring equipment. So like you calibrated your scale knowing that air is not going to weigh very much and it should be at 0. There's an association, a trade association, a professional association, academic association, somewhat similar to the American Economic Association that I was the executive director of for 17 years. The executive director of that association testified this morning, actually. And what that trade association does is it accredits these laboratories that calibrate the equipment that measures the radiation. You get it? It's sort of they calibrate the calibrators, if you will. It's a stage up. There's only 3 firms currently in the industry. It's called ADCL, Accredited Dosimetry. That's the measuring equipment. That's the substitute for the word scale. Okay, Dosimetry Equipment Laboratories. So what happens, those 3 companies, one has 2/3 of the market, one has about 35%, and there's one quite small one, MD Anderson in Houston at the university, connected with the University of Texas, has about 5% of the market. The big one's at Wisconsin that has 65% of the market. The second one, the second largest one, is here in Nashville, out back where all those warehouses are and those roads around the airport. Somewhere, I'm not sure I could get to it again, but I got there one time. It's a private company. It was started in the 1980s by a man here, a physicist. These are people that do nuclear physics, that operate these things. So the dispute is the following. A German company, PTW Freiberg, conceded by the defendants in the case to make the best equipment in the world, bought this Nashville company, K&S Associates. Well, in the accreditation standards, the accreditation standards are worried about conflicts of interest, as well they should be. As well they should be. And what you don't want is for an owner of a manufacturer to buy up the calibration company, and then all the people in the calibration company tell everybody that all the rest of the equipment's crummy. Ours is the only good stuff. Okay? And so that would be a conflict of interest. What is at issue, and what's the guy is the main person is being cross-examined at this very moment, actually, is whether or not the University of Wisconsin and the MD Anderson Center at Texas conspired is a formal word. Influence is probably a less loaded word. The trade association to de-accredit the Nashville company, which they did. It is illegal for you to have your dosimetry equipment calibrated by an unaccredited company in the United States. Outside the United States, there are others that are not accredited ADCLs here, but we have our own system. The rest of the world has a second system. They are different, but it's not clear which one is better. They're debating that as well. And so this is an antitrust case because the plaintiffs are alleging that the largest domestic manufacturer of this equipment, which happens to be 1/3 owned by the manager of the calibration lab at Wisconsin, talk about a conflict of interest, and that's what my testimony was about, and he was on the stand late yesterday, and there's no dispute about the facts there. The question is whether or not they, quote, conspired to eliminate or exclude K&S, the Nashville company, from the market. My job then is to, and economists don't make decisions about whether that's been conspiracy. Judges do that. I mean, I can read the letters and stuff that they have, the evidence they have, as well as anyone else, but I'm not appointed district court judge, and so I don't say anything about that. What I did say something about is if, in fact, that did happen and they were successful, what would this mean for competition in the industry? Well, this is an industry with 3 firms. And one way to look at it is that now this goes down to 2 firms. And while in economics we know that 100 firms is better than 1 firm, indeed for those of you who took an introductory course many years ago, that's usually the only model taught in an introductory course. Lots and lots of firms, so each firm thinks they're a price taker, so they don't think that their own actions can influence the price. Their own actions being like, let's cut back on output so we can sell at a higher price and earn some monopoly profits. And that would be the monopoly model. It really does that. The monopoly restricts output so that all the consumers say, that, oh, there's not much available, and they start bidding the price up. And if you have a product like this in healthcare, that's what we call inelastic demand. A common word for that is you need it. Economists hate the word need. Indeed, I often joke with graduate students, if I ever hear you use the word, you're out of the program even, because it tends to connote that there is no substitution whatsoever. And you know, even if the doctor told me I needed a heart transplant to live beyond 3 weeks, I might say, that costs too much. Let's have one hell of a party for 3 weeks. Now, there won't be many people like that, but there might be a few, and that means that the demand is not perfectly inelastic, that people will pay everything that they have or all wealth, because of course also they may not have the ability to pay enough for the surgery. So there's some elasticity, but this is the kind of industry that I would like to be a monopolist in. I want to be a monopolist. Oh, another good one would be water. I'd like to own the Nashville Water Company, and the first gallon per month that you consume, that's the part you need to stay alive. Let's talk price. You haven't even imagined what I might be charging you. Lots more zeros behind it. But medical services would be a close second behind water, for example. And so there's a prospective real danger here in an industry like this. If it was luxury cruises, if their prices go up 30%, Then they don't fill their cabins, and all of a sudden they realize that while the customers aren't switching to other luxury cruises, if one of them would become a monopolist, they can switch to other kinds of vacations, or they can sit around and watch a television, for heaven's sake. So there's a better substitute. But you know, radiation therapy, when you're told you need radiation therapy, you know, often you're in big trouble at that point, and so you don't give in. And so what the testimony was about was how few is few enough that we worry about it. In other words, 100, clearly we don't worry. If it went down to 99, who cares? If it went down to 10, frankly, who cares? And economics research tries to find out, you know, how few is few enough that it appears that prices really go up. And the evidence is just a little different than what we thought in the 1960s, where we thought, oh man, if you get down to 5 or 6, you're probably in trouble. Most of the evidence now is 6 to 5, no one cares. 5 to 4, no one cares. 4 to 3, I don't know. The evidence is mixed there. 3 to 2, ouch. And it's 3 to 2 and 2 to 1 that are the big changes. And we have evidence, some of you might have heard of the vitamins cartels in the 1990s. They all pleaded guilty to fixing prices. Some good evidence was that after they pleaded guilty and the conspiracies stopped, for those vitamins that were manufactured by 2 manufacturers, even after the conspiracies were uncovered, nothing happened. Prices stayed the same. For those that were produced by 3, 4, and 5, and there were bunches of those, after they uncovered the conspiracies and the conspiracies stopped, the prices went down. Well, they went down because 4 and 5 is too many firms for you to reach a tacit agreement. 2 is not too many firms, because the key to a lack of competition is each seller perceiving itself as having an influence on market outcomes. So a wheat farmer doesn't say to him or herself, if I plant 10 more acres and throw a little more wheat on the market, the price is going to go down. Even though we know if 1 million wheat farmers do that, the price is going to go down. But each one cannot, fathom themselves having an effect. If you're one of 2, that's a big share. And then moreover, on top of that, when there's only 2 of you, can't we just look at the other one? And we don't need a downright conspiracy sign in blood. Somebody might be making a statement that, well, if there was a big price war here, we'd probably all lose, wouldn't we? Just stare at the other person. There's no agreement. Okay, there's no agreement there. And indeed, my testimony was that I'm not arguing that they will sit in the old story was a smoky hotel room. I've never been involved in a case where anybody was sitting in a smoky hotel room because most of the hotel rooms don't allow smoking. But this was a model from the 1930s and 1940s. Was not alleging that there would be any conspiracy like that, but you'll get a price rise just because we understand what's in our best interest when you get down to that few firms. And so my testimony, I haven't seen what the newspaper said, but I hope it said that I testified that this would be few enough to injure competition. And then one other point, because it bears on what that chapter that I skipped in the book is all about. What I just told you is the 1960s story. Since the 1960s, we have become enlightened and realized, wait a minute, if you go from 3 to 2, and 12 other firms, 12 other entrepreneurs say, oh, look, there's only 2 firms in that industry. Let's get into that industry. And we go back up to 12. Well, then there wouldn't be a problem. So what matters is whether you can get into the industry, or what we call whether there's a barrier to getting in the industry. Well, this accreditation problem is the barrier to getting into the industry. Who are the most likely entrants? Well, the way it works to get accredited as a lab is first, you have to build the lab. Okay, that's this disputed testimony between 1 and 3 years and $5 and $10 million. Then you start testing. You have to go as the lab manager and take tests, and they come and do a lot of monitoring and so on. Well, it turns out there are some unaccredited labs around that could, be in a much better position to enter. Where are they? Who owns them? All of the manufacturers of the equipment have one so that they can calibrate their equipment before they first sell it. Okay, that equipment must also then again be calibrated on one of these accredited ones before it can be used on humans. But they don't want to ship it to you and have you take it to one of these ADCLs and have them tell you, what kind of crazy equipment was this? It wasn't even closely calibrated. They want it to be as calibrated, close to accurate as possible. Well, this case is all about a manufacturer being able to own one of these accredited calibration labs. That's what precipitated it all is a company called PTW in Germany bought K&S here. They're the manufacturer of probably the best equipment. And indeed, one way to look at this is if I were a manufacturer in the United States, I would sure like that German company not to have its own kind of footprint with employees, boots on the ground in the United States. They do sell into the United States, but it's nice to keep them far away. The internet's been a big problem because they can even communicate with people in the United States easier now, but we don't want to do anything to help them. Now that's the plaintiff's view of the case. The defendant's view of the case is we need to maintain standards, and a conflict of interest is very important to avoid, and one way to avoid a manufacturer influencing the calibrator that calibrates the manufacturer's equipment is to not let them own the equipment, which indeed the plaintiff would probably agree with, except for the fact that the largest of the calibrators, manager, director, has a 1/3 ownership in the largest manufacturer in the United States. Yeah, and that is actually not prohibited by their formal accreditation criteria. One might argue that they didn't think far enough ahead, or that they used ownership as a proxy for the problem when they should have just stated the actual problem itself, the conflict of interest, and left it to the interpretation of there's a committee that decides this at the time, looking at the facts of particular cases. So the reporter was there again today. In fact, he's about 6'6" and was blocking my way out to come to the class here. So maybe it'll be, I've never seen, I've been involved in several antitrust cases in Nashville. I don't think the press ever covered any of them before, and I don't know why they're particularly covering it, but that's what's going on today, and that's the I pretty much did the chapter that I skipped there with the barriers. The barriers to entry part is important. If the judge says there's no barrier to entry here, well then that's going to undermine, well, it's not going to undermine my testimony. I said if there's no barriers to entry, there's not going to be a problem. But indeed, the conspiracy that's alleged seems to be itself the barrier to the entry of the most likely entrants, and that's what they're arguing about. Let me turn to airlines. I want to do airlines in the draft. The commercial airline industry really started in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we thought this was an infant industry. We often subsidize infant industries. Anybody ever hear of Solyndra? We don't always pick winners very well. Economists are pretty skeptical of government picking winners. Yet we do subsidize them. We build highways for trucking companies. Why shouldn't they have to build their own highways? On the other hand, with railroads, we didn't subsidize them as much. We gave them right-of-ways, but we didn't actually build the rails there. For airports, we built the for airlines, we built the airports. Okay. In addition to that, with the Civil Aeronautics Act of, I think it's 1935, we also set up a regulatory agency whose goal was to promote the financial health of the airline industry. That's the goal, financial health of the airline industry. There's a second regulatory agency called the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. They're the agency that watches that so that the airlines don't put blowout patches on the tires and whatever else they could do save a little bit of money to make more money and be less safe. So safety regulation is not the issue here. The issue, this is not about the FAA at all. They also have the, what do you call them, the air traffic controllers too, as well. Now, the Civil Aeronautics Act was designed to protect the industry because, first of all, there was a fear that when aviation, commercial aviation started, they would get undercut and driven out of business. We call it predatory pricing by someone else. And now, you know, hold your laughter here. It was the railroads that were going to be the big bad guys that were going to undercut airlines and drive them out of business. Well, that was long before we ended up with the railroads all going broke and consolidating and passenger rail becoming heavily subsidized Amtrak and so on. But back in the 1930s, the rails really ruled, and there was a fear that they would selectively, as airlines started a route, that they would selectively undercut the airlines, particularly on parcels and what's the word? Cargo, which is very important for a lot of airlines. I know you're up on the top, but they're also making a lot of money with the stuff that's down there in the hold underneath you. Particular postal contracts in the early years were very important. A second reason that this regulation came about is that this looked like an industry that had a characteristic that has led us to regulate a lot of industries, meaning we don't believe, that competition will work. And that characteristic is that there are a lot of what we call fixed costs or upfront costs. It costs you almost everything to build the plant, if you will, and then you can just let it run. The best example of this is a hydroelectric power plant. Most all of the costs are in building the big dam up front. After that, and putting in the generators, after that, you just turn a spigot and the water goes over and you get electricity, and then you turn the spigot and you stop getting electricity. You need somebody to turn the spigot or push the buttons, I guess, for the hydraulic power to turn the spigot. And that would be a variable cost. That's labor. That's something that continues on. But most of it is a fixed cost. And so in a lot of our industries, telephones, when their wires were involved, that's an industry where technology eliminated this characteristic of the industry. And so, but still, with the distribution of electric power, with the distribution of gas pipelines, so Piedmont or NES, if you pay bills to them, they are regulated. Over the years, we have stopped regulating electricity generation, in other words, coal-fired steam generation plants, because technology has improved so that not as many electrons fall off the wires as they're running along the wires. And as they don't fall off as frequently, line loss it's called, then you can have the power generation station further away from the place where you use it, and indeed far enough away that even we can cross ship and so on. It's one of the great advantages of having a country with 4 time zones is that between 5 and 6 you'll find that some of the electrons are running along wires from power plants in Middle Tennessee running east toward Knoxville, because people get home. The peak is usually at 5 to 6. A lot of businesses still, heavy electricity use ones have not shut down if they are running on a single shift. And everybody goes home, and it is true. I don't know if you're like me. I walk in the house and I'm flipping on lights all over the place, punching the button to heat up the oven, and all of a sudden, you know, probably outside the electric meter is groaning at who's inside there and what are they doing at this moment. And then as you get a little later in the evening, you go to the next hour, a lot of people have turned off their oven, if you will, and the electrons start running the other way. And indeed, so this gives us the advantage of having being able to smooth our peaks out a little bit. I don't know if they probably also even ship electricity across 2 time zones. It allows us to level out our peaks, and so we don't have to build more power plants to handle just that peak. Now, in this area, I think actually the peak is in the summertime for an air conditioning load. And what power companies often do for those 2 or 3 days where they're really near the peak, well, they do several things. One, they contract with Vanderbilt that when we're near our peak, we're going to shut off the electricity to Vanderbilt. What? Yes. Why would we agree to that? Because we get it a lot cheaper all year long if we agree to that. Well, we can't shut the electricity off to the operating room at the hospital. Not to worry, we have our own generators to deal with that peak if we get shut down. And they don't shut us down completely, but often as the faculty were told, the heat index has hit such and such, and the air conditioning will be shut off in your building, like it or not. And if you didn't like it, you can complain, but then you better be willing to chip in with your salary to cover the extra cost of the electricity throughout the whole year. So that's one thing they do. Another thing they do is they will have some less expensive generators, jet engines, for example, that have very costly in terms of fuel use. But you're only going to use them for a couple of days. So you don't want to build a great big dam again, but you do want to try to cover the peaks. So the real trick in a lot of these industries is smoothing out the peaks. The electric power, particularly distribution, gas distribution, all have this characteristic of lots of fixed costs and not much variable cost. That means that as you produce more and more and more, the average cost goes down. When you buy a car, okay, it depends, the average cost per mile that you drive it is going to depend on how many miles you drove it. My mother's last 3 cars didn't accumulate up to 10,000 miles after 6 or 7 years. Her cost per mile was pretty darn high. And I even kept suggesting, a taxi might be cheaper. But I understand you try to take my car away. Yeah, right. So, it's always for someone else, not for me. But for a sales representative that might put 200,000 miles on a car, or that truck I drove back in the 1960s, that had 300,000 or 400,000 miles on it. Yes, it costs more. Water company is the best example of this, actually. One water company in Nashville is capable of having the streets all dug up all by itself. Why do we want 2 of them, separate ones, having the streets all dug up? And there, again, it's all the cost is putting out the pipes and everything. A little bit of pumping. Actually, not where I am. It's gravity, so even when we lose electricity, we keep our water supply, and that depends on where you are. So in those kind of businesses, you prefer to have only one water company, one electric distribution company, and so on. And, well, those products aren't quite like medical care where you need it. They're close to that, and so I would like to own those companies. Boy, oh boy, are you in for a stunner when you get your first bill from my company. You probably complain about a $50 a month water bill. Start adding some zeros. Zeros, more than one of them, because it would be great to be a monopolist. So what we do, what we have done over our history, is to identify these businesses, these industries where we really do want to have a monopoly because of the cost characteristics of the industry. And then we say, you can be a monopoly, oh, but there's one catch. I get to decide what your prices are. And we have regulatory agencies for these things that hold hearings. And the water company, the electric company, the electric distribution company comes in, and in the hearings they testify that their costs, their variable costs are enormous. You need to have prices real high. And then the consumer advocates come in and testify there are no variable costs whatsoever, and costs should be very low. And the regulators are supposed to weigh these and look out for the public interest and choose a price that is high enough so that somebody is willing to invest in another power plant or expanding the electric grid or something when we need it. If you push them down too far that they're going to lose money, they say, fine, you can have the damn thing, and just walk away from it. But not so high, not at that price level that I would charge if I were the unregulated monopolist. Airlines seem to look like this, because think of an airplane. Okay? First person on, what's the cost? The whole plane. Okay, you come along with me. There'll be two of us. Well, now we can split it. Three of us, 1/3 each. Okay, and it seems like this cost curve goes down and down and down. And that's true for an airplane. But we have no airlines that have only one airplane. And in the early 1960s, Dick Caves, who is still alive, he's up somewhere in his 90s now, wrote a book in 1962 in which he demonstrated that this usual argument for regulation doesn't hold for airlines. What you get for airlines is, as the number of passengers start over here at 0 and come toward me, I'll be a higher number, goes up, you get this down-sloping average cost curve as we're filling up the first flight. Then what happens when, and this is fine, now you could go and argue with the airline and say, hey, you know, I'm the last guy on, the cost for me is very little, right? Just be careful they don't tell you, oh no, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. You're the first person on the second plane. Because you can see, so what's going to happen is it jerks back up, and the cost curve actually looks like little pictures of waves in the ocean. And for a reason I won't get into right now, it dampens as well, and eventually gets to just be pretty much a flat line. And so that argument disappeared in the early 1960s. And then the second argument, the one about infant industry, and we have to protect an industry, there is always an issue, indeed lots of inter-family squabbles, the way I described it to my kids all the time, are all about when an infant turns into a child turns into a teenager, and a teenager turns into an adult. And I think the squabbles are probably most severe for the last transition of, you know, I need a car. No, you don't need a car. You need to sit home on Saturday night and read the classics and listen to classical music. You know, so I'm exaggerating to make the point, but no, I'm going out to have a good time, to have a party. And the real issue is who gets to decide. Who gets to decide? It's very important. At one point, maybe I've used this story already, my youngest daughter was trying to decide what college to go to. And we were there the last night with a FedEx package ready to send back in. And we were arguing, and finally my wife says, time out, time out, time out. What's wrong? You're both on the same side of the argument. And we both looked at her and said, so what's your point? Meaning that wasn't the issue. The issue was who got to decide. And even though we both were going to decide the same way, eventually, it didn't start out actually that way, but we had turned over there. And there's a lot of disputes about who gets to decide. We call this consumer sovereignty in economics, and indeed, and we don't believe in complete consumer sovereignty. If my kids said, I said, what do you want for dinner? M&Ms. Nope, you're having peas. They're about the same size and shape. Nobody complains about that. We don't, you know, say that's a loss of freedom and liberty for a 3-year-old, for heaven's sakes. But my oldest daughter's 38. Suppose I go out to dinner with her and she orders, I don't know, a chocolate cake for dessert. And I said, no, you should have peas for dessert. Well, I'm going to lose that one, as I should. Somewhere between 3 and 38 is a flip over. And this is a lot of what we fight about. So the issue was, how old does this industry have to be before it's no longer an infant industry and need help? So here we come into the 1970s, and a couple, actually about 4 or 5 economics books are written. Michael Levine and Bill Jordan write a book comparing the airfares between Dallas and Houston, and between San Francisco and LA, those are very busy markets, to other comparable markets that cross state lines. Without getting into a constitutional law course here, also because I'd be practicing without a license, the CAB could regulate only interstate commerce. There's an interstate commerce clause in our Constitution. So if you stayed within a state, and there's a famous airline today that started out, what are we talking about? Southwest, that's the one that started out in Texas. PSA, Pacific, I don't know what it stood for. Pacific Southwest, and it got subsumed. Somebody bought it. Is it part of U.S. Air today, I think? I think it got bought by the one in the west that U.S. Air merged with. But Southwest is still standalone, and it started out flying intra, I-N-T-R-A, not inter, I-N-T-E-R, state. And if you're intrastate, there was no regulations on your fares. One of the things the CAB did was allow the carriers that flew between two points to get together. This trial downtown says you can't do that getting together part, and decide what price to charge or keep somebody else out of your industry. And so let's go back to the 70s when Braniff and American flew Nashville to Washington, where I went back and forth a lot. They would get together and propose a fare, and the CAB would then rubber stamp it as approved. And now, if anybody starts cutting prices, that's against the law. That's against federal law. So now you get prosecuted. Wouldn't you love to be in a cartel where you can call the FBI and say, hey, they're cutting their prices over there, make them stop? In most cases, you can't do that. And so the CAB thought they were doing the right thing, protecting the financial health of the airlines, letting them raise prices. What the Levine and Jordan book showed was that prices were a lot higher in comparable routes across state lines. I'll show you an example on the next slide in just a moment. Then for those carriers that were flying inside of Texas and inside of California. George Douglas and Jim Miller, the latter who's had a very interesting career, wrote a book on the regulation of airlines that I think is the book that deregulated airlines. It had the right model, it had empirical evidence, and it was written in a way that it was accessible even to human beings, and so it had a great influence. Miller himself later went on to be the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission. He was Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget, so he's had a lot of government jobs, but now he's found his match. He is currently, or at least was a year or two ago, I don't know if he still is, he's chairman of the U.S. Postal Commission. A colleague of mine here at Vanderbilt in the Political Science Department wrote a book about 30 years ago called Impossible Jobs, and running the postal office was one of those. It is, given the demands and expectations relative to the revenue sources, it's a good luck job. So what Miller and Douglas's book pointed out was that with this price regulation, what would happen is Braniff and American would get together. They'd say, we need higher prices on the Nashville-Washington route because our price, let this hand be cost and this hand be price. Our prices are down at our cost, we're not making much money. And historically, if you've invested in airlines over time, as I have in a few, you haven't made any money. I had 3,000 shares of American when it was announced they went bankrupt. I also owned some Southwest shares and sold them, and that covered most of the loss, but not all of the loss. If you look over time, the return to investments in airlines is a little below average. It's nothing to write home about. And you know, there's some up, some down, except for Southwest now. All of them have gone bankrupt at one point or another. So if you had owned them starting back in 1960, you would have lost everything in your investment in every one of them, except for Southwest, if you had bought and just held and held and held and held and held. So prices are down at cost. We need a margin in here. This is the money we make and take home. This is where the CEO's bonus comes from. So they propose an increase. Okay, they propose an increase. The CAB sees the problem and approves it. Then what happens? Wow, this is an attractive route now. We need to get more passengers on this route. How do we get more passengers on this route? Okay, we start out with, if you'll pardon my politically incorrectness, cute stewardesses in the 1950s, right? That's one thing, and lots more of them to help everybody with their coffee, tea, or drinks. Then we have the great sandwich wars, meals. They used to serve, I know none of you is old enough to remember this, but they used to serve meals on airplanes, okay? And there was, in fact, they started serving fancier and fancier meals. Now what's happening here? Price, cost. Costs are coming up here. And there was the great sandwich wars, where then they get together and say, oh, costs are going up. Let's get together and agree we won't serve more than a sandwich. And they get the CAB to approve that. Okay, that'll hold off this. Can you picture 2 pieces of bread with 3 lobster tails between them? I mean, this is kind of a good old American ingenuity at work here, trying to market and trying to sell, trying to get around the regulations. But it wasn't sandwiches that were the most important problem. Today, if you go, I booked a flight this morning on Southwest, and I went to the date, and what do I want to look at? Well, I look at, oh, looky here, it's to Chicago. There were 15 flights or something like that. So how did I pick one? Well, I would go, oh, I like this one, the 6:10 flight, a.m. My wife's going with me. I can't, no, I can't tolerate the abuse. I did pick the 9:20, I think. We'll have to leave home at 7:30. There will be some abuse, but not as much abuse there. We get in till noon, for heaven's sakes, until you get downtown in Chicago, wasting half a day. I used to travel a lot and would leave it on the 6 a.m. flights and come home on the 10 p.m. flights, and she's not a big fan of either of those, but that saved me a day on each end. And when I traveled a whole lot, that really mattered. So what did I look at? I look at the time. I look at the time of the flight. In fact, I also got the American screen up because they fly a lot there to O'Hare. They're much more expensive today. Sometimes they're the same prices. If they're the same prices, then I'd say, 9:20, yeah, I'd be a little safer at 10. There'd be less abuse. I'd pick the 10 o'clock flight, but there was no 10 o'clock flight. You know, sometimes people won't even go if there's only a few flights a day, if there's not a flight within 3 or 4 hours of when they want to go. And indeed, the airlines figured out if we put more flights on, fitting in between the other ones, we can actually, A, steal some customers from our rival who doesn't have a flight at that time, and B, there will actually, that'll increase the total a little bit. Okay. Of course, their rival is no dummy either, and they looked at the same schedule, and Braniff said, oh, American put a flight in between our two. We'll have to match them. And I'm sure every one of you complained about looking up air flights and say, why are they always at the same time for both carriers? In the same way that the one that's even more stunning is the commercials on TV. You know, if you're a person like me who refuses to watch a commercial, I have to go through 6, 7, 8 stations till I can find one of the other ones that is not also on commercial at the same time. And we have some models of why that happens. So the Douglas and Miller pitch is, our airline regulation in the 1970s was a disaster. A disaster because what we were getting was lots and lots more planes, manufacturers like that, the flight attendants like that, more jobs, pilots like that, more jobs, fuel companies like that, but they were half empty. And I flew a lot at that time. I remember being on a plane one time with a senator, Jim Sasser from here. I remember it because it came to a screeching halt at the end of the runway. That's why I remember that flight, but I remembered then I counted the people on board, 11, on a 720 or 737. At that time, we would have had probably 15, 18 flights a day to Washington and back on 730 or 727s, holding 150 capacity of passengers. Today, there are probably about 10 between Delta and American. You can take Southwest to BWI, and they're all in small planes. What's the difference? I haven't seen an empty seat in years on those flights, whereas back in the 70s, I always had 6 seats to myself. I mean, both sides across the aisle to myself. And the issue was prices had gotten very high to give us really good quality. It was nice to fly without having a kid next to you spilling orange juice on you. Okay? That was nice. I liked that. But I wasn't willing to pay the price that you were being asked to pay for that quality of service. So what happened, let me skip that last bottom thing there. That's not important. Here is the example I told you. This all started when Senator Ted Kennedy discovered that he flew an awful lot from Washington to Boston so he could get to the family compound out there at Hyannisport. Here was the, at one point in the early 70s, it was 409-mile flight. They used the same aircraft that was used on the LA-San Francisco route, airfare is about $42. If he was flying San Francisco to LA, a little shorter, but almost all the costs are in the takeoff and landing, not in the distance. There's some cost to the distance. $19. Wow. What a difference there. Well, in 1975, he got a young a guy who was on leave from Harvard named Stephen Breyer. He's now on the Supreme Court. And he was one of his assistants who organized some hearings asking why these prices were so high that Ted Kennedy, had to pay. I guess he was looking to conserve the family fortune, and the Kennedys are always known as being frugal, and was concerned with an extra $20 on his flight home. This effort became bipartisan. This is right after this. 76 is the year I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, working for Alan Greenspan, who was then the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And about all we were doing was working on deregulation of airlines, trucking, of electric power generation sources, of all kinds of things that we thought we could deregulate, only if we could make a case that the case that was made for regulating was no longer valid or never was valid in the first place. We didn't want to just turn everything loose, but there are a lot of cases like this one where there really were no scale economies and this wasn't an infant industry anymore. What really happened was the top there, the first paragraph, is another description of the pricing and costs going up to follow the prices. Fred Kahn, who was an economist at Cornell, was appointed chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board by Carter when he became the president. Remember, Ford was the president in 1976, so I'd like to say we switched parties, although it wasn't too long ago when I told someone I had worked in the Ford administration and their comment was, "Oh, so you're a Democrat." Well, I didn't see it that way. But their view was Gerald Ford would be in the Democratic Party today, probably Richard Nixon as well. Given a lot of their policies of both of them, they may be true. Remember that Ted Kennedy was on board here for deregulation because he noticed what was going on in California in particular. This makes this issue bipartisan. You get somebody important on both sides interested in this. Kennedy talks to Carter and gets Fred Kahn gets him appointed to the head of the CAB. Betsy Bailey, who later was the dean of the business school at Carnegie Mellon, also was one of the commissioners. I don't recall how many there were. There were 5 or 7 or something like that. And they planned to deregulate airlines, except they got complaints from the airline companies, the pilots union, the flight attendants union, the aircraft manufacturers, the passengers in Chattanooga and Clarksville that said a deregulated industry will cut out our service, the congressman from Clarksville and Chattanooga, and couldn't deal with it. Too much pressure. Until one of them said, wait a minute, what about cargo? We still have some of those pressures, but we don't have any flight attendants. We don't have any passengers in those places. Aha! And they deregulated cargo. I think it got up enough gumption to do that in, I think, 1977. Do I have the right date there? Yes. And then something happened. The stock prices of the cargo companies skyrocketed. This turned another group, the CEOs of the airlines. And it was Delta that was firmly against this because they were making some money in the regulated industry. And then all of a sudden they look and say, oh, look at how much we could make in a deregulated industry. And the CEOs of the companies flipped their opposition to this. Moreover, then they got the idea to reduce the opposition to this that, well, we'll just deregulate a little bit. We will let them fly into these unused airports. Many of our main airports today, like O'Hare and Houston Intercontinental and DFW, were built during this period, and there was an old airport left, abandoned. These are now Southwest's airports, Love Field, Hobby Field, Midway, and so on. And then say, well, nobody's flying there, and don't worry, this is another industry, another market. If they want to fly into there, we'll let them fly into there without regulated prices. And moreover, most of these planes aren't even full. They usually had more than 11 passengers on them, but not many more. So let's just, we'll let the others sell at unregulated prices, meaning price cutting, only for their empty seats. Of course, there were a lot of empty seats. About a third of the planes were empty seats. So now we had kind of deregulation that oozed into the industry a little bit through certain airports are okay, some of your capacity is okay, and before they knew it, the industry did not collapse. The flight attendants did not all lose their jobs. The pilots did not all lose their jobs. They did make some concessions and actually had some legislation to require flights into Chattanooga and Clarksville and particularly West Virginia. Senator Byrd was there even back then. And that took care of that political opposition. And pretty soon the political opposition was gone. And the airline CEOs were gangbusters to go for deregulation after they saw how much the CEOs of DHL and TNT and the cargo companies made. And then, so we had, when is it? October '78, the Civil Aeronautics Board, somebody made a motion to go out of business, and it passed. This might be one of the only industries that's ever actually, it took them a long time to sell all the furniture and stuff, but they actually, about 5 years later, closed the door and put a padlock on it and left. And we no longer have a Civil Aeronautics Board. Nancy Rose, who's a professor at MIT and probably is the best overall expert of the airline industry today, as a few years ago estimated that the consumer welfare gain is about $28 billion per year. This comes about in terms of prices lower than they would have been. Lower than they would have been. Actually, the prices from here to Washington today are about the same in nominal dollars as they were in the 1970s. I mean, they really, when you stop and think about it, you no longer have to think of cashing in your life savings to take a trip, an airline trip anymore. You can almost pay it out of your monthly check. Southwest certainly has been a catalyst in this whole process. One of the interesting things today, a very recent study was done to show that shows that airfares are not only lower where Southwest flies, although a lot of the others will match them. We'll match them very frequently. But what's really interesting is airfares are lower where Southwest is at one end of a route they don't fly. So if you were, let's say, Nashville to, where does Southwest not fly from here anymore? It's getting up, Pittsburgh, right? So if you look at the Nashville-Pittsburgh route, well, nobody flies that route, so this won't work. I have to go to Pittsburgh a lot, so I'm sensitive. No, they fly to Kansas City. I need to, boy, they fly so many places now. Okay, is somebody else fly to Syracuse? I hope. If there is somebody flying to Syracuse, but it's not Southwest, and Southwest, because they're here in Nashville, has an effect on that pricing because the other airlines realize that for Southwest to get into that route, they only have to do advertising and selling at one end of the route. They're really halfway there already. Whereas if you pick a route, Syracuse to Pittsburgh or something like this, where they're not in at either end, those are the routes where get your wallet out or your credit card because you're in trouble with the airfare. So this is, I think, a great example of applying economics to asking the question of whether there is a serious market failure and then acting on it and for a real benefit to the general public. And because I have only 20 minutes and I really want to do the draft, I'm going to hold off questions if that's all right with you. This is the most fun one. This is the oldest one. It's the one I'm most interested in because I lived 8 years of opening the mailbox, looking to see if there's a letter from Local Board 29, Hamburg, Pennsylvania. Oh, gee, I even remember the draft board number. Not that this was a traumatic experience or anything like that. Economists, this all started out again with Milton Friedman. This book has the seeds of about 6 of the 12 chapters that are in the Better Living book. And I would say well, where we are today is where he was suggesting we go in 5 of the 6. The one that did not, I mentioned last time, is monetary policy. The irony of this is that was his specialization, was monetary theory. But I think today economists of all ideologies and political stripes don't think just holding the interest rate fixed or holding the money supply fixed. Remember, Ben Bernanke was appointed by Bush 3 times onto the Fed, in the CEA, onto the Fed. And I must say, when I first heard him appointed, I know him pretty well, I said, Ben's a Republican, really? Actually, I couldn't tell what party he was in, which is what I would like to have for my Fed chair, is somebody that I can't tell. But there's lots of Republicans on the Fed today, and they are voting for QE. What number are we up to now? 3, 4, 5, something like that, for manipulating the money supply to try to alter expectations. Other than that, the rest of them, he was pretty much on the money, and really spread the seeds of what later would become the economic analysis that led to the changes. So what's the issue with a draft and an all-volunteer army? Presume everybody understands what a draft is, given your ages. I have to, when I do this with undergraduates, it's sort of like saying making a long-distance phone call. Think about it. No, they have no, I'm not kidding, they have just no idea. They've never heard of the term of a long-distance phone call. They don't know what you mean by that. So we all understand what the draft is. This got to be controversial during the Vietnam War, which, needless to say, was not nearly as popular a war as World War II, although a draft was used in World War II as well. If we only needed the same numbers that we had in Vietnam, we would not have needed a draft in World War II, but the boots on the ground in Europe and the Pacific were way, way, way higher than Vietnam. Economists started worrying about 2 issues, efficiency and fairness. Let me start with fairness. There's 2 kind of fairness issues here. We actually solved one of them pretty quickly, but the other one always remained. Let me use Bob Covington. I know him, so I'll use him as a, let's pretend we're roughly the same age. And what would happen is, where did you grow up, Bob?
Paris, Tennessee.
Oh, anybody from New York? Let's pretend you grew up in New York. Okay. I grew up in an agricultural area where there were agricultural deferments from the draft. And so if you did as I did and told my father I was not going to stay on this farm, and therefore I did not get his agricultural deferments that he had, I was pretty likely to go because everybody else was getting a deferment. Whereas in a big city where you don't have very many people, there were other kinds of deferments, but agriculture was a lot of them, getting those. Then you might say, I got some pretty decent chances here. So the first issue is sort of ex-ante fairness. Luck of the draw, if you will. There was always rumors that Bob didn't get drafted because his grandfather played poker with the head of the draft board. I'm making this up. I can't really. But those rumors were rampant, and we didn't even have Fox News then to spread them. So this was great. Everybody was sure the whole system was corrupt. I don't know if it was or not, but everybody thought it was. So there's the issue of, I know that who gets picked and drafted, who might die in combat, who will have their career delayed, the start of their career delayed. That's all depends on who my father knows, and so on. We actually eventually solved that in, I think it's December, I looked it up here, December of '69 with the draft lottery. And I mentioned this last time, and a lot of you raised your hands. How many had a lottery number? Do you remember your number? 259. You don't? Who else?
365.
Speaking of corruption.
Anyway.
For those of you who don't know, the lottery, the number starting with 1 were the order in which you were going to be drafted. And if you're in the first 200, it was dicey. If you were beyond 250, you were home free. Somewhere in there between 150 and 250 is about where they would stop, depending on the year and so on. Anybody else remember?
Hand me the chips. 366, and I was in Vietnam when I got it.
Well, I was 53, number 53, not 53 years old. And usually I will find when I've been giving this talk, there's a few faculty in the room that are my age that have a number. And roughly, I'd say, you know, somewhere between half and three-quarters remember their number. Now, how many of you remember your telephone number from 1968? You do? I have a clue. Oh, that's because it's still the same. Oh, okay, all right. My point is that for the people who went through this lottery, this is kind of a traumatic experience, and a lot of people do remember the number. Everybody sat around in front of the TV watching this. This was a scheduled show, early December of '69. A higher proportion of the population watched this than watched the Super Bowl last Sunday night, regardless of what the announcers told you. Okay? They were always lying that the most watched show ever was the draft lottery. And I'm excluding things like the airplanes hitting the Twin Towers or President Reagan being shot. Those are not scheduled programs, I hope. At least not scheduled by the networks. Everybody was sitting around. You'd have all your friends' birthdays. It was by birthday. Friends' birthdays on a card. You knew your own birthday. That one wasn't hard. But everybody knew somebody that was 18 to 26, which were the people getting assigned numbers if it wasn't a child, a grandchild, a nephew, a niece, or something like this. And the stakes were even more than that glass globe they hold up after the Super Bowl. It was what you get shot at. Although if you're already in a foxhole in Vietnam, you're already getting shot at.
I learned about my draft number in Vietnam. So I was reading an article in Time magazine. Who here can say what the first draft number drawn was? What birthday? It was September the 14th, and I know that because that was my sister's birthday.
Oh, gee.
And the article in Time said they were sitting around a fraternity house, and poor slob that had the birthday of September the 14th, when it came up as draft number 1, smashed the television. They get theirs out of the newspaper the next day.
Well, let me move on here because I only got about 10 minutes left. So that's one kind of unfairness. The other kind of unfairness is, I get 53, and what was yours, Bob?
259.
259. I get drafted. He does not get drafted, and indeed my career is delayed relative to his. Let's assume I don't get shot. My career is delayed relative to his. There is still an unfairness here. And indeed, the way in which a volunteer army corrects that unfairness is we ask Bob, who doesn't get drafted, to contribute taxes that are high enough to persuade me, who does go in, that I am not worse off. I.e., we do that by letting me volunteer. So the volunteer army has a mechanism to deal with this ex post kind of unfairness. Indeed, one of the objections of Congress when it was proposed was, my God, we'll have to raise taxes to pay the people more. And you might say that's the whole point of this. Yes, you have to raise the rates high enough to get enough qualified volunteers. And in fact, that word qualified is getting more and more important as the kind of intellectual and academic requirements for the military are getting higher and higher. There are very few people that are running around like the infantry in World War II today. And indeed, there's a lot of high-tech stuff is also a reason they want re-enlistments. The training costs are getting higher and higher. To all the buttons and stuff on the guns are a whole lot different than pulling a trigger on an M15 or something like that. So that's the fairness issue. What was the efficiency problems? There were 3 efficiency problems. Well, let me talk about 2 of them right now. One of them is that the Army used too much labor. They were still peeling potatoes with paring knives in the 1960s. By that time, McDonald's had potato peeling equipment invented and was using it. Indeed, I was talking about this at Georgia State, and one guy raised his hand and said, yep, in 1958, I ran the potato peeling machine for McDonald's. That was his job. So it was already invented then. You didn't have to have people with paring knives, but the people with paring knives were getting paid what? Well, during the late 60s, a draftee was getting roughly $1,000 a year in the service, 50 cents an hour, a little less than the minimum wage, which was 85 cents an hour, if you want to have some kind of a balance. But that's pretty cheap labor. And when you have cheap labor, you hire lots and lots of people to do it. When I delivered carrots to Rockview State Penitentiary in the middle of Pennsylvania, they unloaded the truck with having the prisoners come out and pick them into a basket one by one. When I delivered carrots to Campbell Soup, they were in 4x4x4 bin boxes, and the guys with the lift trucks lifted 2 together, and they could empty my whole truck before I could get it parked properly. And they were getting paid by the ton as well. The guys at the penitentiary were getting paid 9 cents an hour. And when you're paid 9 cents an hour, you use lots of labor. They didn't want to buy a lift truck. So that's problem number one. They have the wrong capital labor ratios. And just, I mean, as a little preview here, how many people were on a B-14? Were those the bombers? 24s, sorry. The B-24s out of Italy in World War II, but what would be a crew? I think it's a little bit more. I think it's 9 or 10, actually. There's about 5 gunners. You got a navigator, radio man, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, and so on. How many people are on a bomber today? 0, actually. We go all the way down. And apparently, over the last few days, we found out this is a little controversial as well, to say the least. But just think in between, it goes down and down and down and down. And indeed, there's other reasons to not want to have much of a crew on a plane, but there's also labor costs as well. That if 1 or 2 pilots and co-pilot can do everything, you don't want the other people there. As you get more tech, the planes cost a heck of a lot more than the B-24s did in World War II. So there's a trade-off between capital and labor. The second problem is, as my master's thesis advisor described to me when he was in the military in about 1960, he was sitting around the group of 6 people, and they were actually peeling potatoes by hand with a paring knife. And he, for entertainment, asked them all if they had gone to college, where they had gone to college. And at the end, he found out the 6 of them averaged 1 year short of a postgraduate terminal degree, meaning physician, lawyer, PhD. That was the average. A couple of them actually had their degree, and a couple of them hadn't gotten beyond just a baccalaureate degree. And it struck him that this may not have been the most efficient use of these people, and that there might have been other people that you could get to peel the potatoes, or let me use the example, drive a truck. Turns out, along about that time, I was driving a truck around the roads of Pennsylvania. They should have drafted me and had me in there doing the truck driving job, not had somebody with a law degree or a medical degree there. But if you have an indiscriminate draft, it's going to take some people that have a high value in the private sector. Okay? Now, the volunteer army doesn't do that, and we sometimes complain about that. What the volunteer army does is going to attract people who don't have very good alternatives in the private sector. A lot of people complain about that. The economists said that's the positive part of it. And indeed, if you want to say, well, that's unfair, then you really have an issue with the alternatives that are available, the opportunities that are available to these people in the private sector, because if they voluntarily go into the military, they must think they are better off. And moreover, they're going to get paid more than if they had gotten drafted into the military. So this is called the opportunity cost problem. We're not selecting very well. But the volunteer army, using wages, kind of automatically selects people. Very few physicians, and I guess they actually continued to draft physicians, I think, longer than others. But because, for obvious reasons, the military has a pretty high use of physicians. It'd be nice if it didn't. But people with other advanced degrees that aren't used very much in the military then can go about their way in the private sector. Now, I've talked about all of these except number 3, and I'm going to come back to number 3 in just a little bit. What happened, this is in Capitalism and Freedom, and I got to skip a few things here. Let me get right to the story. of what happened. Martin Anderson, an economist at Columbia, was one of about 6 or 7 economists working on writing articles about the inefficiency of a draft, and those 2 main inefficiencies that I just described. He himself, actually I don't think ever published anything on this, but he had a friend who came to New York, and they went out to lunch at a restaurant that apparently didn't have any napkins, otherwise they would have written something like the Laffer curve on a napkin. So there was no napkin record of this lunch. But during the lunch, Anderson described to this friend, who was working for Richard Nixon's election campaign in 1968, described to him just what I did here, the efficiency and equity advantages of a volunteer army. Anderson went back to headquarters and actually was able to talk directly to Nixon over the next few weeks. And Nixon then in, does it say it there? Yeah, October 17th, 1968, what's that, 2.5 weeks before the election, comes out in one of his speeches and says, all you who are afraid of being drafted or have friends or children you don't want to be drafted, you need to vote for me because I'm going to end the draft. This is better than giving them all a satchel with $100 grand in it. And we know who won the election then. And what he did after he won the election was what we do a lot, and I guess there's talk of doing now for guns, for fiscal cliff, for any issue you have. You appoint a commission, okay, to basically have somebody else to blame. That's the purpose of the commission. Think about that if you're asked to serve on a commission. In November of 1970, Nixon became the president when? In January 20th of 1969. Took these guys almost 2 years, came up with a proposal to abolish the draft, increase pay, and improve living conditions in the military. And so not long after that, Nixon sent a bill to Congress, which promptly deep-sixed it because the Armed Services Committee of the House said, did you say you have to pay them more? Yes. Where are you going to get that money? Higher taxes. Well, if you think raising taxes is a lightning rod political issue only in the last few years, you should read more history of the United States. It's always been an issue. And they said, no, we're not. We can't survive re-election if we raise taxes. So then along comes, so it's done for. We're not going to have a volunteer army. Somehow the hearings got reopened. I don't know that part of the story, but I do know that when they got reopened, not long after that, they brought Walter Roy, who was an economist working at the Department of Defense, in, and he came up with another efficiency argument. That was what was number 3 on my previous list, which was, you know, if you have volunteers, you have people who don't all just want to not be here. All the draftees that I know have started a big calendar of countdown like prisoners are doing. But most volunteers, if you volunteered, many of them are thinking of a career here. That would mean they'd re-enlist. That would mean you don't have to train them up the second time. That would mean you need fewer of these drill sergeants who always had flat tops and would get in somebody's face and spit at them while they were making them do push-ups and so on. Sort of your worst enemy, or those of you who've seen Band of Brothers, the guy training them in Georgia, who they all hated, that lieutenant, yet later who they all said really helped them save their lives because they trained them up. Just think about the kind of teaching evaluations a drill sergeant would get. I haven't thought about that, particularly when some students were accusing me of being like a drill sergeant. Yeah. Well, Oy pointed out that you could actually have you needed 5 to 6% fewer people in the military if you took out all the people involved in training. Moreover, to make everybody happy, you could take those nasty drill sergeants and put them in a division and send them out to the front lines. Of course, that would get a lot of support from all the people who had been trained by those drill sergeants. This lowered the cost enough, just enough, to get enough of the Armed Services Committee in the House to vote yes on it. And then it went to the House, and it did pass. For some reason, I'm not quite sure, it was never controversial in the Senate, and it was going to sail through. And so it was signed in September 71, but just to protect themselves, they delayed it 2 years till it became effective. I turned 26 in February of 71. What's 26? Why 26? What does that matter for? You're too old then. You're too old. The military does not want people over 26. People like Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, these people are over the hill. They're over 26. You wouldn't want some old, decrepit men like them fighting for you, would you? Are they serious? They really do. I would like one of each on each side of me. Tell them, you take the guys that jump into the trench with us. You take care of them for me. I'll watch your back. Okay, that would be my job. So why didn't the military want people over 26? This is nuts. Has nothing to do with their physical skills. It has to do with the culture of the Army. You know, what changes as it was only men in those days, get older as more of them are married. They're recently married, so they still like their wives. And they might not want to die. And so a lieutenant said, let's charge the hill. And the older guys say, oh, time out here. Let's do a benefit cost analysis of charging the hill. And then somebody says, where's Pete? Pete's the 18-year-old in the platoon. Oh, he's up at the top of the hill already, because you know the younger guys, the training of boot camp is to follow directions, to don't question things. Don't say, you know, could we bomb them instead? Or if you're an economist, could we buy the hill? Something like this. The Army doesn't work this way. It won't work if you start doing stuff like that. So that's why the 26. So I got to live all 8 of my years. I actually was not drafted, ironically. I did not do anything to avoid it other than I got a wonderful opportunity to actually teach at Penn State when I was 24 years old, because somebody quit in late August. And I was the only person around who was trained up to teach those courses. I was completely unqualified. I had a class Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 8 a.m. Now you know where I was on the totem pole. But indeed, that was a legitimate draft deferment, and the university applied for one. I was turned down. I was 1A. They appealed it. I didn't do anything. They just took care of it. And at the end of the year, they won the appeal. Then I moved to Wisconsin, probably one of the dumbest things I ever did, because I lost it, but made it through the next 3 years without the draft board coming after me, and my friends and I would speculate about why, and all they said was, don't ask! The one hypothesis is, well, they tried you and they failed, and they don't want to go through the process again. Well, I didn't have a legitimate draft deferment after that point, and so they wouldn't have had the hassle that they had, but I just lucked through. At one time in the economics department at Vanderbilt, there were 4 of us who grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, western, in New Jersey, all within about a 100-mile radius. One was an assistant professor, one was an associate professor. At the time, I was a full, and one had a chair in the department. And the difference in the career advancement of each of us was explained by what happened to us regarding the draft in the Vietnam War. The assistant professor had first gone to teach high school in Trenton, New Jersey, and then after 3 years, he decided it was safer in Vietnam. He's probably right. Then he joined the Peace Corps, and they sent him to Kingston, Jamaica. And the rest of Jamaica might be okay, but don't walk around at night in Kingston. And he spent several years on that, and then he had a couple other years. He was about 8-10 years behind the rest of us because of this. The associate guy, he did not get drafted because he took a teaching job at Spelman College, and that was a legitimate draft deferment, like the one I had at Penn State that I stupidly gave up. I was next in line, and then the guy who was the chair professor had flat feet. And if you have flat feet, you're out of the Army. Doesn't affect you.
No, you're not.
Well, then you were. Yeah.
You weren't.
Well, he had something with his feet.
Flat as feet. Let me tell you
Oh.
about Vietnam.
Well, he had something about his feet that kept him out, that did not hurt him from playing recreational games, I guess it would be the way to say it. Yeah. So I think I have covered everything that, and I appreciate your patience. I did extra 5 minutes. What I'm going to do next time is the sports stuff, the NCAA stuff. That's not in the book. And I was supposed to tell you that the slides, these slides are available somewhere. I don't know where. Do you know where to find them if you want to look at them? Yes, I did give them to Norma, and I think she put them up. So the next time, though, I have a different set of slides about the NCAA.